Loving a master who kicks you is not a problem if that is all one feels. But loving and hating must be kept a dirty little secret, for loving the master one hates inevitably induces confusion and self hatred. That was why I never threw myself as wholeheartedly into the study of French as I did with English, and why, ever since leaving the lycée, I had hardly ever spoken a word of French. French was the language of our enslaver and rapist, whereas English was a novelty, heralding an American arrival that spelled the end of our French debasement. I mastered English without ambivalence because it had never mastered us.
Well, you just heard from Pulitzer Prize-winning author Viet Thanh Nguyen reading from his latest novel, The Committed, a sequel to his 2015 debut, The Sympathizer. It follows the double agent and self-described man with two faces to Paris and is also published in French as Le Dévoué. Viet, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, the passage you read conjures some of those conflicted feelings of your protagonist, a man who's half Vietnamese, half French, describes himself as somebody of two identities. He's talking about his relationship with the French language there. And throughout the book, his identity feels a bit like a love-hate relationship. For you, was it a smooth amalgamation of two things or a contradiction in terms?
Oh, I don't think anything in my life has ever been a smooth amalgamation of anything. Like my narrator, I'm a conflicted person. I feel like I'm also a man of two faces and two minds. And I really wanted to write this novel about France because like my protagonist, I have some ambivalent feelings about French culture and French politics, but I'm also in love with France at the same time. So this is a novel about someone who has been physically and mentally colonized and has now come to France to confront the French legacy of his own ancestry.
Now, as I mentioned, the central character was a spy, a double agent in southern Vietnam in your previous book, The Sympathizer. And for someone who's seen the very worst kind of scenes of war, atrocious behavior, he doesn't seem very tough. He's sometimes quite comically emotional. I felt quite bad laughing at him at times during the book. How did you build his personality? What sort of traits were you drawing on there?
I wanted him to be someone with tremendous political compassion, conviction and compassion, and a man of action, but also someone who was deeply conflicted and tormented. And that sense of torment would give us this sense of internal drama, and then hopefully make him someone who was likable, despite sometimes the terrible things that he has done or that he's witnessed. And so there has to be a sense of his vulnerability and his being trapped in situations that are comic and absurd, which are both tragic, but also hopefully will make us laugh a little bit as well.
Tragicomic is certainly the right way to describe him. Now, one of his most comical habits, for me as someone who lives in France, was an incomprehension of certain French cultural eccentricities. For example, he says in the book, we listened to a greatest hits tape of Johnny Hallyday, the sonic equivalent of Ricard Pastis, a taste the rest of the world could not acquire. Are you speaking from experience here?
Definitely speaking from an experience, and I think I've offended a lot of French people who don't understand why other people don't like Johnny Hallyday, for example. And I've tried a few times. I like other French pop singers, but just not him for some reason.
He's a very, very French acquired taste, I suppose. Now, more seriously, the book shows us the immigrant experience in France here through his eyes. He's often referred to as Le Chinois or just Asian as opposed to Vietnamese. Based on your own experiences in the US as a Vietnamese immigrant and here in France, the vast amount of research that you did about that experience, what would you say is the major difference for Vietnamese immigrants in these two countries?
Well, number one, the history was very different for the Vietnamese who came to France versus the United States. So in France, there's a great degree of ideological diversity among the Vietnamese French community. You have conservatives, you have leftists, and so on. In the United States, mostly anti-communist Vietnamese, very, very conservative. And then there's two different senses of national identity. So in the United States, you can call yourself a Vietnamese American. Here in France, I think saying you're Vietnamese French or French Vietnamese doesn't make any sense. And so the French of Vietnamese ancestry here really think of themselves as being French first. And that's quite a bit of a different emphasis than in the United States.
It's interesting because throughout his encounters with French society, that protagonist meets the descendants of Algerian immigrants here in France and gets a whole new perspective on the very loaded word Arab in French society. The relationship between France and its former colony is still very tense 6 decades after Algerian independence. Now, President Macron recently paid tribute to those Algerians who died due to police violence here in Paris in 1961. That was a written communique, not a vocal apology. How do you see the road to reconciliation on that issue?
Well, it's an issue that's true for every country. I think every country has had these kinds of tragedies and conflicts that completely contradict the national self-image that people have of themselves. And so for a lot of French people, obviously Algeria, the period of colonization, this particular atrocity have been shameful or have been difficult to talk about. So being able to even acknowledge the existence of these kinds of events is absolutely crucial. Incorporating the history into the school curriculum, making sure that Algerian voices and Algerian perspectives are also heard. These are also really crucial. And then finally, the establishment of actual relations, compensations, reparations. These are all kinds of acts that go beyond the important but insufficient act of apology.
Both cultural and political there.
Right.
Now, going back to your own personal story, you came to the United States as a refugee with your family in 1975 at just 4 years old. It's an experience that has fed into a lot of the literary work and certainly informed your opinion on that issue. Now, in recent months, Viet has spoken out about the plight of Afghan refugees and the responsibility of the United States. Indeed, since then, some people have been forced to live in hiding in Afghanistan, fearful of the Taliban. That includes artists, many of whom have tried to flee the country, including Asita Fraudus in Kabul. Here's more from her.
The motivation I had in the past doesn't exist anymore. An artist requires a quiet and peaceful environment, so I don't do much. As I said, I'm not able to hold an exhibition of my art, and I can't express the intentions and concepts I have in my mind. If there were no such restrictions, I would love to stay in Afghanistan, but as far as I know, these restrictions will remain the same, so I've decided to go abroad.
Now, in August, as that tumultuous time was happening in Afghanistan, Secretary of State in the US, Antony Blinken, said of the takeover of the Taliban, this is not Saigon. And when you think of the scenes in Kabul this summer, you hear from artists like Azita. Do you think the two scenarios can be compared?
I think they can be compared, but of course they're very, very different. Different histories, different wars, different players. But the fall of Kabul itself, I think, was strongly reminiscent of the fall of Saigon in the sense that so many people were desperate, so many people were being left behind. When I'm speaking of American allies, and just as the United States abandoned so many of its Southeast Asian allies in 1975, we could see that happening in Kabul as well. Of course, there was an American evacuation. It was as chaotic or more chaotic than it was during the fall of Saigon. Some people who were allies got out, some people who were not allies got out, and a lot of people were left behind, as we saw in the case of this particular artist. So my heart really went out to the Afghans who felt that their lives were under threat. And for the ones who were left behind, it does bring for me echoes of what the South Vietnamese who were left behind had to contend with, which was a radical change in their existence, the sense of a closure of possibility for them, and so many more had to flee after 1975. So I think for a lot of Americans, Afghanistan is over. But for many Afghans, it is not over, and it will continue. This experience of fear and the need for flight will continue for many more years.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of that refugee experience, one of your earlier books of short stories, The Refugees, deals with the treatment of immigrants in a host country and the perception of them as well. We saw a marked rise in racism against people of Asian heritage in the US, in France, in the UK during the pandemic, people with absolutely nothing to do with COVID or with China. What do you put this sort of regression down to? What's stoking it?
Well, I think that anti-Asian racism and feeling have been present in places like the United States and from the very beginning of Asian immigration into the United States. And that well of latent anti-Asian feeling and racism has always existed to be drawn from in times of crisis or stress that can be blamed on Asians or Asian immigrants. And the United States is not unique. Other countries that are not dominantly Asian, that have Asian populations, as you said, also saw surges of anti-Asian feeling. And that's because the stereotypes and the misrepresentations of Asians are global. And the fear of various Asian countries, now China, as being threatening, have been on the minds of the West for a very long time.
Now, to go back to more recent work, The Sympathizer is being adapted into an HBO series, I hear, with Robert Downey Jr. attached to the project, Park Chan-wook directing, no less. This is proper Hollywood stuff. And when you wrote your first novel, I believe you were just working at the university, as you still do as a professor, and you were relatively anonymous. How odd was it being propelled into this more glamorous world of prizes, movie stars?
Well, I live in Los Angeles, and when I tell people I'm a writer, nobody cares. But when they find out there's going to be a TV series with HBO with Robert Downey Jr., everybody gets excited, including my own son. He's 8 years old. He couldn't care less what I do. But Tony Stark being in the TV series, he's very, very excited. So I think the thing here is that I respect the artistry of Robert Downey Jr. and Park Chan-wook. I trust that together they will be able to pull off something brilliant. The TV show will be its own thing, but also will bring more attention, of course, to the novel and to the story that it tells about the war, Vietnam War, Vietnamese refugees, American society and its contradictions, and all that will be wonderful.
Absolutely. Well, finally, we ask all of our guests to give us a cultural tip at the end of the show, and you've pointed us in the direction of a series, Reservation Dogs. It's about teenagers in rural Oklahoma. Tell us what really sold it to you.
Well, Reservation Dogs is the first TV show created by Native American people. The producers, the writers, the actors are all indigenous Americans, and it's a very funny, very entertaining, and very poignant show about the lives of these young Native Americans on this reservation who are basically sort of aimless and also sort of petty criminals. It's very entertaining to watch and also provocative because it brings up an issue that many Americans have a hard time reconciling themselves with, which is that the United States is a colonizing society built on the lands of indigenous peoples who still exist, who still survive, and who want their land back.
Some very thought-provoking entertainment there. Viet, thank you so much for coming in today. Now, we'll leave you with a taste of that series, Reservation Dogs, available on Disney+. Otherwise, you can get more arts and culture on our website. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. There's more news coming up on France 24 just after this.
Took me like a month.
What kind of gang was both red and blue?
Indian Mafia couldn't make up their minds if they want to be Bloods or Crips more. Maybe they're Blips, or maybe they're Cruds. Hey.
It's easy to be bad, like the man. It's hard to be a warrior with dignity.